Requirement 2, intention. We saw in the earlier video that the three essential elements of a contract are 1. An agreement, 2. An intention to create legal relations, and 3. Consideration. In this video we focus upon the second element of a contract, intention. Not every agreement that we make is a contract. Typically the difference between an agreement that is not a contract and an agreement that is a contract is that the people who made an agreement that is a contract intended for it to be a contract. In other words, they intended that the agreement between them would be legally enforceable. In deciding whether or not this second requirement of a contract is satisfied, the courts do not attempt to work out the actual intentions of the parties who made the agreement. Rather, the court looks at the conduct of the parties from the perspective of an objective observer and asks whether the parties were behaving in a way that indicated that they intended the agreement to be legally enforceable. In other words, the court imagines if a person was observing the parties at the time they made the agreement, would they think that these people intended their agreement to be legally enforceable, or would they have intended that the agreement be one that was simply a social or domestic or a friendly arrangement that was not intended to be a legally enforceable contract? In applying the objective test, the courts have traditionally made two very important presumptions. First of all, if the agreement is made in a social or domestic context, the court will presume that the agreement was not intended to be legally enforceable. In other words, if the agreement is made between two friends or between two family members, the court will presume that the agreement was not intended to be a contract and instead was simply intended to be a friendly arrangement. In Balfour and Balfour from 1919, the material facts were that Mr. and Mrs. Balfour entered into an arrangement whereby, while Mr. Balfour was in England working and Mrs. Balfour was residing in Ceylon, Mr. Balfour would pay to Mrs. Balfour a monthly sum. Mr. Balfour, after a period of time, decided to renege on the deal and stopped making that monthly payment to his wife, and his wife sued her husband for breach of contract. The legal issue was whether or not Mr. and Mrs. Balfour, when they made that agreement that Mr. Balfour would pay a monthly sum to Mrs. Balfour, whether they intended that agreement to be legally binding and legally enforceable. The court's decision was that since this was an arrangement between a husband and a wife, it was a domestic arrangement, and that the presumption was therefore that it was not intended to be legally enforceable. This is not to say that friends and family members cannot make contracts. They certainly can make contracts, but they have to overcome that presumption. And so a person who wants to enforce a contract with their friend or with their family member has to persuade the court that the circumstances of the case were such that it would have been obvious to an objective observer that the parties did intend to be legally enforceable. In Wakeling and Ripley from 1951, the agreement was between a brother and a sister to the effect that while the sister resided with the brother in his house and looked after the brother, who was elderly, the brother would leave the house to his sister in his will. The brother and the sister had a falling out, and the brother removed the gift from his will. So the sister sued the brother for breach of contract. The court had to decide whether or not, when the brother and the sister made that arrangement, an objective observer would have thought that they intended that agreement to be legally enforceable. Now, the presumption, of course, is that since this is an agreement between a brother and a sister, it was made in a domestic context and therefore was not intended to be legally enforceable, but the sister was able to persuade the court that since in order to move in with her brother and look after him, she had to actually move from the UK to Australia at some considerable cost, an objective observer would have thought that that arrangement, given the cost involved, would have been intended by the parties to be legally enforceable. So the court decided in Wakeling and Ripley that there was a contract between the brother and the sister. The second presumption is essentially the opposite of the first presumption. If the agreement is made in a commercial or business context, the court will presume that it was intended to be legally enforceable. So if you make an agreement with a customer or with another business, the presumption is that that agreement is intended to be a legally enforceable contract. Again, the presumption can be rebutted, so it is open to one of the parties to argue that even though the agreement was one that was made in a business or commercial context, the parties nevertheless did not intend it to be a legally enforceable agreement. So, for example, businesses frequently make promises to their customers that in the circumstances are clearly not intended to be legally enforceable. So they might say things about their product that are obviously an exaggeration, and as long as it's obvious that the business did not intend the promise to be taken seriously, there will be no contract and no breach of contract with the customer. Courts traditionally refer to these sorts of promises as sales talk or puffery or mere puff. In Carlisle and Carbolic Smokeball Company, in the case that we've been looking at closely in these videos, the Carbolic Smokeball Company argued that its promise to pay a reward of £100 to anyone who caught the flu after using their product was mere puffery. It was sales talk. It was obviously a promise that was not meant to be taken seriously. It was just something they were saying to make their product more desirable. The court, however, pointed to the wording in the advertisement that we saw earlier to the effect that the business promised that it would pay the reward and that it had the sum of £1,000 deposited in the Alliance Bank on Regent Street as proof of our sincerity in the matter. The court said that that indicated that this was a promise that was clearly intended to be taken seriously and was clearly intended to be legally enforceable. And so the court decided that the second requirement for a contract, intention to create legal relations, was satisfied in the case of Carlisle and Carbolic Smokeball Company. In the next video, we will look at the third and final requirement for a legally binding contract.